Stop overthinking. Start doing. The Feynman way. Here's something that might sting a little. You could be the smartest person in the room and still accomplish absolutely nothing. Not because you lack talent, not because the problems are too hard, but because you've fallen into one of the most seductive traps the modern mind has ever created, the illusion that thinking more is the same as making progress. Richard Feynman watched this happen to people his entire career, and he hated it. Not in a dismissive way, not with contempt. He hated it the way a great teacher hates watching a brilliant student drown unnecessarily. Because Feynman understood something that most of us spend decades learning the hard way. That there's a point where thinking stops being a tool and starts being a cage. And the moment you can't tell the difference between the two is the moment you stop doing real work. This is the story of how one of the greatest minds in human history learned to escape his own head, and how his method, direct, irreverent, almost stubbornly practical, might be exactly what the modern mind needs most. Let's start with a question. When was the last time you actually finished something? Not just thought about it. Not just outlined it, researched it, debated it with yourself at 2 a.m, or saved 17 articles about it to read later. When did you last take a real idea and push it all the way through to an actual result? For a lot of people, if they're honest, the answer is uncomfortable. Not because they're lazy. Quite the opposite. The people most prone to this particular trap are often the most intellectually curious, the most conscientious, the most serious about getting things right, and that's exactly the problem. Feynman called it, in his own blunt way, philosophy without physics. And to him, it was almost a form of intellectual cowardice, dressing up inaction in the clothes of rigor. To understand why Feynman thought this way, you have to understand where he came from. Growing up in Far Rockaway, New York, Feynman was obsessed not with the idea of science, but with the doing of it. His father, a uniformed salesman with no formal scientific training, taught young Richard something that would shape his entire worldview, that the name of something is not the same as knowing something. You can call a bird a brown-throated thrush. You can know it in 12 languages, but when you're done with the naming, you still know nothing about the bird. You know nothing about what it sings, where it flies, what it fears, how it chooses a mate. Naming feels like understanding. It isn't. This lesson embedded itself deep in Feynman's approach to physics. And later, when he encountered the academic world with its committees and conferences and endless theoretical debates, he kept coming back to that same gut-level test his father gave him as a boy. Okay, you've talked about it. But do you know it? Can you do anything with it? Does your thinking lead anywhere? And here is where the modern crisis becomes so painfully relevant. We live in an era of unprecedented access to information. At any given moment, you can pull up an article, a lecture, a podcast, a documentary, a 12-part series on almost any topic your mind wanders to. You can spend 6 months reading about Stoicism without ever practicing patience. You can consume 40 hours of content about entrepreneurship without building a single thing. You can memorize entire frameworks for decision-making and still be completely paralyzed every time an actual decision arrives. We have confused consumption with comprehension. We have confused debate with discovery. We have built entire identities around the sophistication of our questions without ever demanding that those questions lead somewhere. Feynman saw this pattern starting even in his own time, and he was relentless in resisting it. There's a famous story about his time at Cornell after the Second World War. He had spent years working on the Manhattan Project, doing some of the most intense, high-pressure physics of the century. And when he came back to academic life, he found himself completely blocked, couldn't work, couldn't focus. The problems all seemed either too small or too overwhelming, and he fell into a spiral of worrying about whether he was doing the right things, thinking about the right problems, living up to the right expectations. He was overthinking. Feynman, the man who would eventually win the Nobel Prize, and then something shifted. He was sitting in the Cornell cafeteria one day, and someone threw a plate into the air, one of those dinner plates with the Cornell medallion on the rim. As the plate spun, Feynman noticed it was wobbling, and he noticed that the wobble and the spin seemed to be in some ratio to each other. He didn't know why. There was no great reason he needed to know why. It had no obvious application to anything important. But it was interesting. The motion was interesting, so he started working it out. Not because it mattered, not because someone assigned it to him, not because it was going to lead anywhere in particular, because it was right there in front of him. It was real, and it was interesting. That calculation led, through a winding path he couldn't have predicted in advance, to some of the foundational work in quantum electrodynamics that eventually earned him the Nobel Prize. Stop. Think about that for a moment. The cure for his paralysis wasn't a better framework. It wasn't a productivity system. It wasn't more thinking about what to think about. It was doing something. Something small. Something concrete. Something that started with actual engagement with the physical world, rather than endless meta-analysis about the nature of the work. This is the first and most important principle of what we might call the Feynman method for breaking mental paralysis. The way out is through doing, not through more planning about what to do. But let's go deeper, because there's a reason this is so hard. The overthinking trap isn't stupid. It comes from something real. It comes from the very reasonable recognition that mistakes are costly, that complex problems require careful thought, and that rushing into things without adequate preparation often leads to failure. These are not wrong instincts. The problem is what happens when those reasonable instincts get amplified and distorted by anxiety and perfectionism and the modern world's endless supply of more information to consider. Imagine you're standing at the edge of a swimming pool, trying to decide whether to jump in. You could spend time thinking about the optimal dive angle. You could research water temperature effects on the body. You could survey everyone around you about their experience with this particular pool. You could build a comprehensive mental model of every possible outcome. And meanwhile, the afternoon is passing, and the pool is right there. And at some point, the thinking has stopped being preparation and started being avoidance with better vocabulary. Feynman had an almost physical intolerance for this kind of loop. He would often say, in various forms, that you don't understand something until you can explain it simply. But what gets less attention is the flip side of that principle, that you often can't explain something simply until you've actually played with it directly. The understanding doesn't always come before the engagement. Sometimes it only comes to it. This is a revolutionary idea dressed in plain clothes. Most of us operate on the assumption that we need to fully understand something before we can meaningfully engage with it. We want to read all the books before we start writing. We want to understand all the market dynamics before we launch the product. We want to resolve all our doubts before we commit to the path. But Feynman's approach turns this completely upside down. You engage first. You mess around with it. You make contact with the real thing rather than your mental model of the real thing. And the understanding, real understanding, the kind that actually lives in you rather than sitting in a stack of notes, the understanding arrives through the doing. He called this getting a feel for something, and he treated it as absolutely essential, not optional. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine two students studying the physics of waves. The first student reads every textbook, takes meticulous notes, builds careful diagrams, and can recite the equations perfectly. The second student spends an afternoon at a beach, just watching waves, watching how they stack and interfere, how they reflect off rocks, how their behavior changes with the depth of the water, how two waves can meet and either amplify each other or cancel each other out. Now ask both students to describe wave interference. The first student will give you the correct answer. The second student will give you a true one. That distinction, correct versus true, is something Feynman spent his whole career chasing, and it's why he was so suspicious of thinking that wasn't tethered to direct experience. Correct answers can be memorized. True understanding has to be earned through engagement. But here's where it gets interesting. Because the problem isn't just that we overthink before acting. There's a second, subtler failure mode that Feynman's approach addresses, and that's the circular kind of thinking. The kind that goes around and around the same territory, visiting the same objections and considerations over and over without ever advancing the ball. If you've ever lain awake at 3 a.m, turning a problem over in your mind for the 4th time, covering the same ground you covered at midnight and at 1 and at 2, you know exactly what circular thinking feels like. It has a distinctive texture. It feels like work. It has the quality of seriousness, but it produces nothing. You wake up just as stuck as when you went to bed, except now you're also exhausted. Feynman's response to this was almost comically direct. When he was stuck on a problem, he would work on a different problem. Not as a permanent escape, not as avoidance, but as a genuine cognitive strategy rooted in something real about how insight actually works. The frontal lobe, which handles our deliberate, focused, analytical thinking, is only one part of the apparatus. Some of the most important cognitive work happens in what neuroscientists now call the default mode network, the brain processes that activate when you stop focused thinking, the connections that form when you let the analytical mind rest and let something more diffuse and associative take over. Feynman understood this intuitively, even without the neuroscience. He understood that sometimes the act of hammering at a problem directly is exactly what prevents the solution from appearing. You're too close. You're thinking within the grooves you've already worn into the problem. A different problem, a walk, a conversation about something completely unrelated. These aren't distractions from the work. They are, sometimes, the work. He was famous at Caltech for spending time at a topless bar near campus, working on physics problems in the noisy, distracting environment. Not despite the distraction, but in a strange way because of it. The slightly chaotic, non-academic setting prevented him from taking himself too seriously, from falling into the ruts of formal academic thinking. It kept the thinking playful and alive. Play is a word Feynman used constantly, and it's worth sitting with. Because play has a specific quality that overthinking destroys. Play is inherently willing to be wrong. Play has no ego investment in the outcome. Play follows curiosity rather than strategy. And play, perhaps most importantly, actually happens. You cannot play in theory. You can only play by doing. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this is all well and good for a genius like Feynman. He could afford to play around because his underlying capabilities were so extraordinary that even casual engagement produced brilliant results. What about the rest of us who genuinely need to be more careful, more deliberate, more thorough? This objection is understandable, but it gets the causation exactly backwards. Feynman wasn't free to play because he was a genius. He remained a genius in part because he never stopped playing. The willingness to engage directly and playfully with problems, to pick up the plate and calculate the wobble because it was interesting, without needing permission or guarantees, that was the engine of his insight, not a luxury he could afford because the insights came easily. The insights came in part because he refused to let overthinking strangle the curiosity that produced them. Here's another thought experiment. Imagine a musician who has studied music theory exhaustively. They know every chord progression, every scale, every harmonic relationship. They understand counterpoint and orchestration at a sophisticated level. But they have become so preoccupied with playing perfectly, so anxious about every possible mistake, so committed to having the whole piece fully mapped in their mind before touching an instrument, that they never actually play. They never make music. They have all the theory and none of the music. Now imagine a child who knows 3 chords and plays them with complete abandon, who experiments, makes mistakes, stumbles on combinations that are strange and then unexpectedly beautiful. Who doesn't know enough to be self-conscious and therefore discovers things the theorist would never find? Who is the musician? This isn't an argument against theory or preparation. Feynman was one of the most rigorously prepared physicists who ever lived. It's an argument about the relationship between thinking and doing, that they need each other, that neither works properly without the other, and that in the modern world the balance is tilted dramatically and dangerously in the direction of thinking at the expense of doing. Feynman had a particular contempt for what he called cargo cult science, the practice of following all the outward forms and rituals of scientific thinking without the substance, setting up the papers, using the right vocabulary, going through the proper motions but never making actual contact with reality, never running the real test, never looking honestly at what the evidence actually says. This critique extends far beyond science. There is cargo cult thinking everywhere. People who have the vocabulary of self-improvement but never actually change. Organizations that have all the frameworks for innovation but never actually innovate. Intellectual communities that can articulate exactly what's wrong with contemporary discourse while contributing nothing to fix it. All form, no contact with the real. The antidote, in Feynman's view, was relentless return to the concrete. Every time the thinking started floating free of actual phenomena, actual data, actual experience, you drag it back. You ask, what would we actually observe? What would actually happen? Can I build something small that tests this? Can I find one real example, just one, rather than 10 theoretical ones? This is the third principle. When paralysis strikes, make something smaller and more concrete. Not a theory about the answer. A small, actual, tangible step toward the answer. A sketch. A rough calculation. An experiment with one variable. A single honest conversation. Something that produces real information rather than more material for deliberation. There's a version of this that Feynman described in the context of his teaching when he was trying to prepare a famous lecture series, what became the Feynman Lectures on Physics. He struggled enormously with how to present certain concepts. He could think about the best approach endlessly, or he could go stand in front of actual students and try to explain the thing and see immediately from the looks on their faces what worked and what didn't. The feedback from reality in a single hour of teaching told him more than weeks of private deliberation could have. Because reality is not subtle. When something isn't working, it tends to show you pretty clearly. The problem with staying inside our heads is that our internal models of reality are always more flattering and more orderly than reality itself. We think our explanation is clear. The confused student tells us otherwise. We think our argument is airtight. The counterexample breaks it open. We think we're ready. The first real attempt at the thing reveals the 7 things we hadn't considered. This is not a reason to fear engagement with reality. It is the entire reason to seek it. Because here's the profound thing about what Feynman's life demonstrates. The errors and confusions and discoveries that emerge from actual engagement are not setbacks. They are the physics. They are the information. They are the very thing that your thinking, however sophisticated, cannot generate in isolation. Feynman won the Nobel Prize for quantum electrodynamics, a theory that describes how light and matter interact at the quantum level. It is, by some measures, the most precisely verified theory in all of human history. The agreement between its predictions and experimental measurements is so exact that it would be like measuring the distance from New York to Los Angeles and being accurate to within the width of a human hair. That extraordinary precision didn't come from more thinking. It came from continuous, rigorous, humble dialogue with experiment. The theory made a prediction. The experiment measured reality. If they disagreed, the theory had to change, no matter how beautiful the thinking had been. This is the deepest version of Feynman's anti-overthinking philosophy. It's not just practical advice for being more productive or getting unstuck. It's a fundamental epistemological stance. Thinking doesn't validate itself. Only contact with reality validates thinking. And a life spent entirely in thought, never completing the circuit, never letting reality weigh in. That's not rigorous. It's the opposite of rigorous. It's just very elaborate guessing. Think about what this means for the modern problem of information overload. We are drowning in more ideas, more frameworks, more perspectives than any previous generation has had access to. And paradoxically, this abundance doesn't help us think better. It often makes the paralysis worse. Because now there's always one more article to read, one more angle to consider, one more objection to address before you can feel sufficiently confident to act. Feynman would recognize this immediately as a trap. Not because information is bad, but because information without action is just inventory. You can warehouse ideas indefinitely. The warehouse fills up, but the physics, with a project, with a relationship, with a life, doesn't happen inside the warehouse. So here is, synthesized as cleanly as possible, what the Feynman approach offers someone who is stuck in their own head when paralysis appears. Do something concrete rather than think more about what to do. Follow genuine curiosity rather than strategic importance. Change perspective by actually changing what you're working on. Make the thing smaller and more real until you can actually touch it. Let reality respond and treat that response as information, not judgment. And understand at the deepest level that thinking is a tool in service of understanding, and understanding is only real when it can do something in the world. There is a kind of intellectual humility in this that is genuinely radical, because it requires accepting that your thinking by itself is incomplete, that you need the world to finish the thought, that the universe knows things your mind doesn't, and the only way to access what it knows is to ask it directly. Through experiments, through attempts, through willingness to be surprised and corrected and redirected. Feynman describes science as a way of not fooling yourself, which is to say it's a discipline for making your thinking accountable to something outside your thinking. And the tragedy of the overthinking mind is not that it thinks too much, it's that it never makes the thinking accountable. It turns over the same questions endlessly, producing the illusion of rigor while actually just spinning in the safety of a loop that never has to meet the test of the real. You are smarter than you think. But you are also wrong about more things than you know. And the only way to find out which smart ideas are also true is to take them out into the world and let the world respond. The plate wobbles. You do the calculation. Something surprising turns up. You follow it, and somewhere down that path, there's a Nobel Prize, or a finished project, or an understanding you couldn't have reached any other way. The world is not waiting for more people who think very carefully and never arrive anywhere. It has plenty of those. It's waiting for people who are willing to take imperfect ideas and imperfect experiments and imperfect first drafts and put them in front of reality with genuine curiosity and genuine willingness to be changed by what they find. That willingness, that fundamental intellectual courage, is what Feynman had in abundance. And it had nothing to do with genius. It was a choice, made again and again throughout an entire career. To stay curious, to stay concrete, to let the wobbling plate matter more than the perfect theory waiting to be born. Stop planning to understand. Start the understanding now by doing. The physics doesn't happen in your head. It happens in the world, and the world has been waiting very patiently for you to show up.